Fab. Tusen tack. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the event. So the work I'm going to be speaking about is my current work. It's Thinking in Progress, and it's an exploration of the more than human in young children's literacy and language practices. Specifically, I want to argue that there has been an overemphasis on language as an exclusively human pursuit, and also on the role of adult humans talking directly to younger humans as the only means by which language is learnt or taken up. Instead, I want to show that objects, things, places, atmospheres, and a whole host of non-human and more than human players have an important role to play in how words and texts emerge in early childhood spaces. This thinking is grounded in particular in my current research project, which is a British Academy 3-year fellowship examining the role of place and objects in young children's literacy practices. Today, in particular, I'm going to present some of the ideas I developed when I was collaborating with Professor Margaret Somerville of Western Sydney University. This presentation is based on a paper which we co-authored. You can read it in the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and it came out last year. So really, this work has been foundational to the ideas and the questions I'm taking forward as I begin this current 3-year fellowship project. So I thought it would be a good starting point and something which I've developed. So I'm going to present examples of my data from the UK and also Margaret's data from Australia. And together we hope the examples will make the case for understanding young children's literacies as always inescapably more than human. So, I hop into the car with Mum, Dad, and baby in the car seat in the back. The baby, 19 months, looks at me askance and then looks away as if to say, I don't know you. You don't belong to this constellation of Mum and Dad and me. Then turns back, lifts up shoe, opens and closes the Velcro strip. Rip, close, it sounds, pointing to me. I lift my shoe, point towards him, and undo the zipper. Then I do it up again. Undo, do up, zip, zip, it sounds. Zip, zip, he sounds. He points to my shoe, reaching for it. So I stretch my leg across the back seat, give him the shoed foot with the zip undone. He takes the shoe off the foot, tries to work out how to put it on. Shoe on, shoe off, zip, zip, zip. Game over. We arrive at our destination. We eat dinner, and then back in the car 2 hours later, his shoe lifts up towards me. Rip, close, and I respond, zip, zip, reach out, pass leg and shoe across to him. Shoe off, shoe on. Zip, 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 he says. This communication in the restricted space of the back seat of a car was initiated by the 19-month-old child. Restrained in the baby car seat, the child uses everything at his disposal: shoe, foot, leg, fingers, sounds, gestures, and movement to conduct a prolonged communicative exchange which does not involve words. This evoked many similar examples that Margaret and I had been sharing in our exchange across hemispheres about literacy, language, the non-verbal, and the more than human over the past years. Our observations of young children in place were shaped by the significance of physical movement in young children's communication. In the examples we discuss in our paper, the children march and jiggle around a museum, and they climb in and out of a river, scooping up mud and spinning in circles. So the conversations between Margaret and I began with children's movement as communication, and we go on to argue movement as a world-forming practice. In addition, we began to trace the close connection between movement and sound. Movement and sound both exist within and beyond the human. Young children's movement and sound always occur as complex entanglements of relations within more than human worlds. They are always the result of entanglements with places, objects, and things. So throughout our collaboration, what emerged was an understanding of sound in relation to movement. And so I want to say a little bit more about that next. So scholars of sound studies point out that sound is resonance. It's created by vibrations. And these vibrations, to quote Walter Gershon, have the potential to affect and be affected by another aspect of everything. Understanding sound as resonance highlights that sound can exist above and beyond human perception, and indeed what one individual hears is socio-culturally constructed. These conceptualizations of sound are useful to us, firstly, because words, vocalizations that children might make, and the environmental noises around us can all be considered equally. Human vocalizations and words, then, can only be understood in relation to the sounds of the more than human world. To draw on Stephen Fell's work, we're talking here about an emplaced, all-species approach to vocalization. So secondly, at a molecular level, sound is vibrational movement. Scholars like Moore and Yamamoto describe the interconnection between movement and other sensory categories, and they conclude, to quote, "The oneness and unity between speech and body motion in normal behavior is truly awesome. Movement is frequently required to make and perceive sound at different scales and in different ways." So these were the ways of thinking about sound and movement in relation to each other as literacy practices which exist beyond the human that we took forward when we began to think about the examples from our data. So I'm going to start with a snippet of my data. This is from a longer ethnographic study, which was actually my doctorate, looking at young children visiting museums. And in this snippet, the two children, Brian and Izzy, are moving with drums. Of particular interest for this audience is that the children have been in a museum in the UK, but they've just been into a small exhibition gallery about life in the Arctic. So they brought the drums from the exhibition into the corridor to play with, and that's what I'm going to show a really brief example of in the clip. Showing this footage in this audience gives a different kind of meaning. I mean, considering the importance of drums in Sami culture, which I hadn't considered when I was actually collecting this data, this offers a different kind of recontextualization of the same data, which I acknowledge would be something to be really interesting to think more about, particularly when I come to talk about this data and I start considering the role of the non-human players in this episode. I think the significance of the drums to Arctic culture lends a whole new way of re-narrating the meaning of this episode. So we'll have a play now and you can see what you think. Nice. Okay, so when I originally analysed this data, I was deeply interested in the competency, the communicative abilities of the young children. So I analysed this video in my doctorate, and I stressed the synchronicity between the movements and the actions of the two children. I noticed their glances, their eye contact, pauses to wait for each other before they drum and march. However, on reflection, as Holtman and Taguchi write about, I realised that originally my attention had been artificially drawn to the human subjects in this episode. Coming back to the data with a post-human perspective meant trying to shift my gaze, trying to pay attention to more than just the two children in this episode. It meant trying to understand the children as two bodies among many others, a whole collection of objects, ideas, architecture, and places which are involved in this kind of event. So when we revisited this episode, Margaret and I, we were struck by the central role of the more than human world, including the drums and the wooden sticks, but also the layout of the different spaces in the museum, and the importance of these things in the production of the sounds of banging, the marching, the scuffing of the shoes, and the movements that were produced by both the marching and the drumming. Karen Barrad's description of being in the world stresses the codependency between the humans and non-humans. She writes, so Linda Taguchi writes, the skin is not the border of our bodies, but a territory or region of interference, a diffraction of communicative waves between matters. The loud, rhythmic nature of the drumming and the synergy created between the sound and the body movement come together to create a strong, affective response. Shoes scuff on the flooring, and they move in an arc around the corridor space, and they're accompanied by the sound of the banging drum, and also these kinds of non-linguistic chants which emerge from Brian's vocal cords, and all of these things happen in rhythm with each other. Whilst the drum is clearly important, the architecture in the museum also plays an important role here. For example, the children move from a small enclosed space in the Arctic exhibition through to this corridor. So the locations of things like the walls and the ceilings, closely sloping together or loftily far apart, and also the flooring, which is carpeted in the exhibition, but is hard laminate flooring here in the corridor, all produce the sounds of banging and marching differently as the rhythmic vibrations created by feet and drums bounce off the different surfaces. So this is what I mean when I say sound always exists and extends beyond the human protagonist. Drawing on Karen Barrad's work, Michael Gallagher highlights that the vibrational properties of sound are a way, he says, to decenter the human, positioning it as just one kind of body amongst many through which sound propagates. Maggie McClure has pointed out that the use of words to represent bodily experience can tend to obscure the experience themselves. In our transcriptions and our analysis of the data, both Margaret and I frequently struggled with the inadequacy of words, the way in which words demand to be arranged in logical, linear sequences of sentences, creating, therefore, partial, unsatisfactory accounts of exactly what is happening in this kind of event when children are entangled with place. The marching and the drumming are interactions between the children and the drums and the place, and the whole thing occurs without really any discernible words, but with an excess of meaning, as intense movements and sounds from both the children and the wider, more than human world create a new version of place. Okay, so this second video is Margaret Somerville's data, and it was collected during a project in which she invited two little girls who are 3 and 4 years old to take part in exploring the concept of entanglement in young children's play. So I'll give you a little taste of this video too. So these are ordinary episodes. These are the kind of data that would be really familiar to anybody who works with or lives with young children. How can we understand them in all of their complexity and all of their entanglements? All the way through this video, Charmaine is singing and talking and humming. She makes sounds and she tells stories. And in the shift from just transcribing the meaningful words to trying to focus in general on the sound, it becomes apparent that the sounds of the place and the sounds of the child's voice are echoing each other. The river gurgles over the stones. The birds twitter and chirrup and trill loudly and softly, and Charmaine vocalizes her way through this event, all the while totally immersed in place and play. This entanglement between human sounds and movement and place has major implications for literacy studies. Literacy, especially print literacy and writing, but also talking, assumes a logical linear sequence of a meaningful narrative. But when movement and place are added into this, the linear sequence is really heavily disrupted. The chronological ordering of time is not possible, as water and mud and movement and vocalizations all sound simultaneously. Words fail, as much of this occurs at the limits of language, where vocalizations aren't words, or they're so entangled with the water and the play and the voice that they're not really distinguishable. Words merge with each other and with the sounds of place. And words are difficult to find to describe these sounds and these actions. Movement, gesture, water, and sound are all equally crucial, and they equally arise in synchronicity with the mud and the water. So in the first two examples that we gave in this paper, the child in the car and the drumming in the museum, there was lots of sound and lots of meaning, but it didn't evolve into recognizable words. However, in the example of the children playing in the river, there were commentaries, stories, and sentences. These still, though, can only be understood as emergent with the world, in the sense that the water and the mud seem to drive the action. Human makings with mud are continually redirected by the questions posed by the mud and the water at the interface. What is water and what is mud? How is the water and how is mud? As the girls become water river, swishing water from the river to make dry mud wet, and gathering up mud to form shapes and make the wet mud dry. Human words and stories give way to sensory entanglement with mud and water. So she begins with a story, and then the story just trails off in the longer video. Movement and sound are the ways in which mud and water pose questions, and the children answer through gestures, body movements, vocalizations, songs, and words, and are deeply entangled with these wider, more than human movements, some of which result in sounds and words at the level of human perception. Rather than seeing two children coordinating their actions amidst the drums and the floors and the drumsticks, or amidst the mud and the water at the river's edge, these episodes can also be read as the more than human world coordinating the actions of the children. It's the rhythm of the flowing river, the speed and texture with which the mud falls from the hands, and the force with which the drumsticks bounce off the skin surface that drives movement and action, that generates sounds and words. The children only appear coordinated with each other because they are both equally in tune and entangled with the movement and vibration of the more than human world. Vibration, the coming together of surfaces through movement, is the notion that connects all the examples that I've given. In the example in the car, parts of the shoe and the body parts and the vibrational sounds these make are mimicked by the child. And the space of the car is remade by these gestures and sounds, and time is collapsed when the actions are repeated hours later when they return to the car. In the museum, the child's bodies and drumsticks and drums come together to produce vibrations and re-inhabit spaces. This re-inhabitation of space can be read as a world-forming process. Each of the different places of our observations offer different experiences of sound, movement, and literacy. Therefore, different places enable different repertoires of literacy practices to emerge. So with the strong emphasis being placed on young children's vocabulary, which is frequently referred to as evidence of their proper development or their communicative competency, thinking instead about the interconnection between sound and movement is particularly helpful for rethinking early childhood literacy. In the wider field of literacy scholarship, definitions of literacy are expanding to better account for the role of bodies, objects, and places in processes that are increasingly understood as emergent, entangled, and embodied. So in the paper, we have argued that posthumanism has the potential to extend this work through a decentering of the human within conceptualizations of early childhood literacy, and through a theorization of the non-representational aspects of literacy practices. We found a focus on sound as vibrational movement of bodies, both human and non-human, combined with thinking about the connection between sound and movement, a really fruitful way for thinking about young children's vocalizations, their gestures, and their movements. So in conclusion, what are the implications of, to quote Lenz Taguchi, going beyond the human-non-human divide when we think about language and literacy? Language and literacy have historically been positioned as key attributes that grant humans some kind of special status over and above the non-human world. And obviously this is of deep concern with regard to issues of sustainability. In her critique of dominant models of communication, Ruth Finnegan points out that a common assumption across interdisciplinary theories of communication is that messages are first constructed in the brain and then they're communicated through the body. And I don't think that's necessarily happening all the time in the videos I've shared today. In an opposite proposition, Sheets-Johnson proposes thinking in movement, arguing that thought can originate in the body, not just the brain. Thinking in movement stands as critique to the frequent conflation of thinking, language, and rationality, and the association of these three things with what it means to be human. The proposition that thinking can originate in the body opens up new possibilities for understanding young children's emergent language and literacy practices as being generated both directly and spontaneously through multiple bodies coming into being in the world. The implications of post-human readings of emergent literacy practices are that young children's literacies are not seen only as embodied sensory experiences, but also as inseparable and embedded in their entanglement with the wider world.